Welcome back to Reimagining Us. I'm Nicole Argo, the founder and executive director of the Together Up Institute. I am thrilled that we will be focusing today on the topic of belonging and excited, as always, to be here with my co-host, Scott Hutchison from E Pluribus Unum.
Thanks, Nicole. It's always great to be here and wonderful to be joined by all of you listening in. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about these topics and wanting to think or do more with them.
We are really fortunate to be joined by John Powell. John spells his name in all lowercase. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, where he holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion and is a professor of law, ethnic studies, and African American studies. John was previously the founding director of the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota, and he served as the national legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. He is well known for his work developing the frameworks of targeted universalism and othering and belonging, and he most recently published 2 books relevant to our conversation today. They are Belonging Without Othering, How We Save Ourselves in the World, co-authored by Stephen Menendian, and The Power of Bridging, How to Build a World Where We All Belong.
John, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we dive into your work, let's start the conversation a little more personally. What in your life experiences inspired you to delve into the concepts of othering and belonging? Was there a particular moment or a story that shaped your perspective?
Well, Scott, it's good to be here with you and Nicole, and I look forward to having this conversation. I've written about that some, and I think our life have many stories and many arcs, and we're not entirely sure. We sort of pick one, and in my book, I talk a lot about my relationship with my parents, particularly my dad, where I have a very close-knit, loving relationship with my family. My mom and dad has passed. But there was a rupture. And there was a rupture when I was 11 years old. And particularly with my dad around basically religion. I was concerned about Chinese and what was going to happen to them. The church couldn't adequately answer that question for me, so I left the church. For my dad, that meant he couldn't have fellowship with me. That was the doctrine of the church. If someone fell away, you were not supposed to have fellowship. And my mom was a bridger. My mom was not about to lose her baby boy, which I am, 6 of 9, or her loving husband. And so she created a bridge and a container. She did that many times to sort of keep us together. And during that process, it was very painful for me as an 11-year-old because I was close to my parents, close to my family, very confused, and really close to my understanding of God, all of which I left at that age. So I wasn't sanguine about what I was doing. I was confused, I was hurt, I was sad, I was lonely, I was othered in my own family. And in a sense, my mom brought us all back together. And I think that lesson of being othered in your own family, being othered in an intimate set of relationships, was constitutive of who I am. But I say that with a caveat that I also know that we're never completely sure. So, but I think that that's one of the sort of turning points in my life.
I mean, I think there's a lot of people, myself included, who can relate to that because when intimate relationships, whether you know what that is, I would not have used the word othering at that point in my life, but you know what it feels like. And so thank you for that story.
So let's pick up on that word, othering. I've heard you say often, othering is a problem of our time. And in your book, you describe how othering divides us by turning differences into threats. Can you define othering for our listeners and say more about it?
Sure. So othering is a funny word. I acknowledge that. Belonging is a little more common, but it's also, not necessarily a household word, but it is a household feeling. And basically it's where we don't accord someone full dignity, full respect, uh, full expression of the humanity. And it's a range. It can be, not talking to someone, not interested in someone, isolating someone. But it also can be not letting someone vote. It can be segregating people in a certain neighborhood. It can be genocide. So there's a range of which we other people. And the we who are othering people also has a range. It can be one-on-one, which tends to be not as pernicious, but it can be a community against another community, or a community against a person. In my case, that I described earlier, it could be your family or members of your family. But also it can be institutions and the nation state. So we are obviously the penultimate example in some ways is what happened in Germany. The German state basically not just othered Jews, but then said they shouldn't exist. So there's a range of othering from very small slights that we hardly notice to extremes. And when we deeply other someone, we also don't see them as fully human. And when you don't see someone as human, it gives you permission to do terrible things to them.
To draw that back to polarization and identity-based divisions today, I've seen you talk about othering as a means of building identity in some of your writings and your talks. Would you say a little bit about that?
So in some ways, othering, we use othering to create belonging. So I think the foundation for human social engagement and flourishing really is belonging. And I like to remind us that we're all born physically attached to another human being. It's not a metaphor, it's a physical reality. And it's also a psychological and spiritual reality. While we may cut the umbilical cord, the physical cord, we never cut the spiritual cord. At least if we do that, we do it at our own peril. And so we, in a sense, we need each other to, first of all, we need other selves to have a self, have our own self. We need someone to recognize. We need someone to care for us. We need someone to reflect what we think. We are born into a language. We didn't create the language. It was here. We're born into it. It helped shape us. We're born into a community. We're born into a family. Maslow basically described belonging in some ways, not quite, but some ways the antithesis of othering, as being the third most important human need. He said, physical safety, food, belonging. His students have actually reversed that order, and they said belonging, physical safety, and food. And why they say that is that you don't get physical safety and food unless you belong. You need to belong in order to actually thrive. But it's more than just physical. It's psychological, it's emotional, it's spiritual. And so part of what happens is that we use othering in order to create belonging. So we say, if you want to be part of my group, you have to hate that other group. We also say that other group, at the extreme, is threatening our belonging. And therefore, we have a right to keep them out of the country. We have the right to keep them out of our neighborhood. We have the right to kill them. And we're doing it in service of our own sense of need to belong and safety. So when we talk about the other, we almost always talk about that in relationship to our own sense of safety. And it's important to realize that the other is a social construct. There's no natural other. So we make up ways of othering people. Someone's too tall, someone's too short, someone speaks with an accent, someone eats funny food, someone worships God differently, someone doesn't worship God at all, someone has sex differently. None of those things in themselves creates another. It's our social meaning attached to it. And those meanings are social, so they're not arrived at just at an individual level. We need what we call leaders and conflict entrepreneurs to tell us, be afraid of that person. You don't feel good, it's their fault. You're worried about your future, it's their fault. And we are worried about the future. We're worried about the future in part because the future is fraught with change, with radical uncertainty. I woke up this morning and listened to a podcast on AI, and really, from experts, and they don't know what to make of it. They don't know if we should be celebrating or we should be afraid, we should be speeding up, or we should stop. Um, and these are the experts. And so, in some ways, the polarization is not natural; it's curated, it's manufactured, it's cultivated. Once it's there, it seems natural. So we sometimes say people naturally want to be with their own. We don't ask the follow-up question: what constitutes their own? Does it mean people of the same race? Well, look at the explosion, not just in the United States, but all over the world, of people who marry across racial and ethnic divides. Uh, who's their own? Does it mean people of the same religion? Does it mean people of the same nation state? Again, there's no natural their own. And so we use the other to constitute the belonging group. We use them to constitute us, which is important in two respects. One, it means that on one hand, we need the other. We're using the other. It's the glue that's holding us together in many respects. But on the other hand, it also means the fundamental thing we're reaching for is belonging. And what we're most afraid of is that we won't belong. And so if you think of the Proud Boys marching in South Carolina, they're chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." Now that's a Nazi trope from the 1930s. It's offensive, it's anti-Semitic, and it's also informational. It's telling you that on some level, they are worried about there not being a place for them in this imagined future. And it's an imagined future because there's no indication that Jews are trying to replace the Proud Boys. It doesn't matter because when we are deeply afraid, deeply anxious, the part of the brain that's most active is what's called the lizard brain. It's the amygdala. And the amygdala it organizes our fear. It doesn't speak factually. It doesn't do citation. It doesn't read research papers. It's not rational in the sense that the newest part of the brain is, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is literally at the front of the brain. The amygdala is at the back of the brain. So the amygdala speaks a different language than the prefrontal cortex. And sometimes we get confused. We say, why would people believe such a crazy thing? That's not rational. When people are deeply fragmented, I prefer polarization, but polarized, they're also operating out of fear. And you can either excite that fear, which we call breaking, by talking about the other is coming to get your cat, or you can assuage that fear by saying, we're creating a new reality with a larger we. And let's be curious about each other. Let's learn about each other. Let's see the complexity in each other. So one of the things that happens when we polarize or break, when we other, we also flatten people. They become two-dimensional. What do we know about them? Very little. We may know their race. We may know their ethnicity. We may know their religion. But we don't really know them. And we're not really even all that interested in them. What kind of food do they like? Do they like broccoli? Do they have children? Are they a painter? And we all have this complex aspect to who we are. But when we other people, they become caricatures, they become cartoons. And therefore, again, it allows us to do terrible things to them. They're not like us.
I think our listeners would really appreciate going a little deeper into how we construct that and why we construct those things. I would love to hear more.
There's a saying that seeing is believing. But a lot of scholars have actually reversed that. Believing is seeing. Believing is seeing. And so the world is not just out there to be seen. It's what we believe that we actually construct what we're seeing. And we can show that through all kinds of experiments. But just think about a couple of cases. Take race, for example. At the height of Nazism in Europe and Germany, um, the Germans believed there are 4 different kinds of white people. And you couldn't always tell them apart by looking at them. So the Aryans were at the top, Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans were at the bottom. And they were seen as a different species, which now sounds a little crazy, right? Think about one of the most important cases in the United States, Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, most people probably don't know this, was what's called an octoroon. He was only 1/8 black, whatever that means, and 7/8 white. He was phenotypically white. If you saw him on the streets, or if you look him up on Google, you can't tell he's black. So wait, weren't we saying black and white was some visual representation? The visual representation is gone. What does it mean to say someone is passing if it's visual representation? In Brazil, they do race differently. Each country does race. Each state does race differently. Some states would say 1 drop of black blood and you're black. Others would say, 1/4 black and you're black. So literally a person could be black in one state and go to another state and be white. These are social constructs. And so, again, Homer Plessy was an octoroon. We don't talk that way anymore. But he was, for all intensive purposes, in an important Supreme Court case, he was black regardless to what he looked like. So, and this is part of our history, right? So in Brazil, they do race very differently than we do. In Brazil, if you look white, you are white. And so two children can have the same biological parents, and one be white and another be not white. And when we look at that, it's like, that's strange. When they look at us, it's like, you guys are strange. So I did some research with a colleague, African-American, light-skinned African-American woman in Brazil. And she wanted to interview Afro-Brazilians. And our host said, that's fine, but there may be a little awkwardness. You, a white woman, wanted to interview Afro-Brazilians. And she said, I'm not white, I'm black. And she said, they said, no, you're white. And they went back and forth and back and forth. And then my friend, her name was Lynn, she's since passed, she said, this is going to be a game breaker. And the host said, probably not, because we in Brazil know there are a lot of white people in the United States who think they're black.
I live in New Orleans, John, so I know the Homer, the Plessy Ferguson case. Is just where that happened was just a few miles from where I am now, and thank you for that, because I think that kind of just contextualizes for people what we're talking about, and hopefully opens up. I know it opened up mine when we started having those conversations. About that, and so powerful.
The greatest per capita genocide in the 20th century was not Germany and Jews; it was actually Rwanda. And the groups were the same race, we would say. They were the same religion. There was the same language. It's like, and yet, when they start killing each other as the other with machetes, it was brutal. And one of the things that made one group different than the other group, since it wasn't color, since it wasn't race, since it wasn't language, since it wasn't food, was how many cows you have. So that became the organizing principle, one of the organizing principles for the other. Think about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I've been time there, and people have done incredible things to move beyond these fissions, these fractures, these polarization. But walking around the streets, someone would say, there goes a Catholic. How can you tell? I can't tell. They learn their cues. So Catholic and Protestant have very sensitive cues to sort of, so when you look around the world, you see these differences. There's a book called "What Difference Does a Difference Make?" That is something we decides what difference a difference makes.
I will never forget being a graduate student in social psychology, learning about something called the minimal group paradigm, right? When it comes to this social construction of race, that if you would just tell a group of participants in an experiment that um, you all are triangle people and you all are circle people, that people start to project meaning onto that. Well, maybe the triangles are extroverts and the circles are introverts, or maybe it's because I have lots of siblings and I don't, but that people had to find a narrative to explain it. But what was interesting about a minimal group paradigm is that it sets in motion so many of the heuristics and biases that go with social identity, that we favor the in-group members. In this case, you might give them more erasers or pencils or whatever the swag that your group has. And this is about triangles and circles. This is about nothing. We are really, I love the quote you brought up that I had not heard before, John, that believing is seeing. We have so much data and science to support that these days.
And there's a famous experiment that's been replicated, brown eyes, blue eyes, where a teacher takes elementary school kids, and one day, and they've been together for some time, but one day she decides to identify them as brown eyes and blue eyes, and she disparages one group. Oh no, you don't want to play with brown eyed kids. Brown eyed kids go to the back. And by the end of the day, all the blue eyed kids are feeling superior and are denigrating the brown eyed kids themselves, even though they're friends, even though sometimes it's the same family. And then she flips it. The next day she flips it. And the same thing happened. And just shows how fragile and susceptible these markers are. So they're social. So the meaning is not the difference that's at issue, it's the meaning we socially attach to it.
So let's pull this together. You've said that identity is socially constructed, that our need for belonging often means that we other to create a sense of self within a group. And I think the question that might be rising for our listeners is how can we then embrace our individual and group identities while also fostering this bigger we, this inclusive sense of we?
Nicole, that's a great question. And one of the books I wrote with a colleague, Steve Menendian, is called Belonging Without Othering. In a sense, the arc of human history in many ways is creating larger and larger we's. Think about 6,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, most people lived in tribes, bands that were relatively small, 50 to 200 people, your whole life. That's it. That's your community, your whole life. People didn't associate with people because of their race or because of their religion. It's like this is your tribe, this is your family. At some point, the capacity to identify with people got bigger. And according to a lot of evolutionary biologists, part of it was being able to both imagine and tell stories, which apparently we didn't have 2 million years ago. So Neanderthals didn't have the capacity, and even early Homo sapiens didn't have that capacity. So we could tell stories and imagine things that we're not seeing. And so, what are some of the stories? Well, if you read Harari, who wrote the book called *Sapien*, he said one of the stories is religion. So now we have 2.5 billion people who call themselves Christians. 2 billion people who call themselves Muslims. Many of them will never see each other. They are different races, different ethnicities, different language, different food, but there's something that binds them together. And this, from Harari's perspective, and this is not meant to be disrespectful or belittling, he says it's a story. It's a story that they share. The nation state is only 500 years old, even less really. So what does it mean to be an American? That's a story that didn't exist before then. So we tell these stories, and our identities get infused in these stories. And there are different times where things happen in the environment that put pressure on the way we understand ourselves. So, for an example, I'm sixth of nine children. People say that's a big family, right? 100 years ago, it would have been a small family. Uh, in the 1850s, when we were still on farms, 14, 15 people in the family was not unheard of. Now it's very much unheard of. If you say I have 8 brothers and sisters, the next question, are you Catholic? I mean, what's wrong with you? We don't do that. People didn't just decide to have fewer children. Something else happened. Our identities are constantly being pushed and pulled. We're constantly churning. We're constantly interacting with each other. Um, we're constantly part of each other. Sometimes we don't like it. Um, and we can participate in it, and we should, but we can't control it.
John, in your work, and you've mentioned this a little bit already today, you talk about bridging as a practice to overcome othering and division. Can you explain a little bit more about what bridging means and share, like, maybe an example of where it's helped
Mm.
people recognize and counteract othering? Because it's a word that I think we're all hearing a little bit more now.
Sure, Scott. And the thing is, we need to bridge with where there are cleavages, where there's conflict. Uh, and sometimes that's obvious, right? So if you think of a Trump supporter and a Harris supporter, or a Trump supporter and a Bernie supporter, but sometimes it's less obvious. Sometimes we need to bridge within our own family. Sometimes we need to bridge within our own selves. There are parts of me that I don't like. I'm trying to push it away, and it keeps coming back. Um, and I also say we need to learn to bridge with our fears. Fear, by some accounts, is our oldest emotion. It's there serving a purpose. Now, oftentimes it's misused, inappropriately used, but the goal is not to get rid of it. The goal is not to denigrate it. So bridging basically means, as you suggested, connecting. And the process of connecting with the other, the manufactured other, uh, is compassionate listening. It's being present with them. It doesn't mean resolving the conflict. So it's not conflict resolution per se, although it's associated with it. It's not fully understanding the other person per se. It's not persuading the person per se. It's really being present and seeing the person's humanity. Uh, and that may sound like a little, but that's a lot. There's a South African word named sawubona, a Zulu word. And what it means is, I see you. It also has been interpreted to mean, the God in me sees the God in you. And there are whole books written about the importance of being recognized, that people want to be seen. So it's not surprising that Ralph Ellison wrote a book, which I think he may get a Pulitzer Prize for, called Invisible Man, who's saying black people in the United States were invisible. And what black people want is to be seen. What every person wants is to be seen, to be recognized, to have dignity. Um, and so when we ignore it, sometimes we'll say that, like, and this is not to excuse what he's doing, but Putin has made it clear that one of the things he's pissed about is that he felt like Russia became ignored. He talks about the dignity, not wanting to restore Russia's place. He's nursing an injury with 6,000 nuclear weapons at his disposal. Uh, when the Chinese were blockaded in by the English over 100 years ago, to them that was yesterday. That was not just the blockade; it was humbling. It was humiliating. And so, part of bridging is to say, I see you, not I agree with you, and we have to see and experience the person not just with the head, but with the heart. Um, and the head, the mind wants to be right. The heart wants to connect. Um, and sometimes we're afraid to see the other person because we disagree with them. You can still disagree, but first, open up to actually seeing the person. And there are hundreds of examples. One of the ways we see people is to acknowledge their sacred symbol, to acknowledge what's important to them. Not saying it's important to me. So beautiful example that Nelson Mandela reflects. In South Africa, the Afrikaners, there are two main groups of whites, the Afrikaners and the English, Dutch, they speak a different language. And at some point, this Afrikaan, they decided that public instruction in schools would be in Afrikaan. The blacks in South Africa were livid. I'm not going to be instructed in the language of my oppressor. So there were strikes and boycotts throughout the country. Soweto was probably the most famous. At that same time, Nelson Mandela in prison is asking his prison guards to teach him Afrikaner, to teach him their language. And not just their language, their customs. Now, the amazing thing, because they're his captors. When he gets out of prison, the president of South Africa and Nelson Mandela met, and they talked about having a peace, ending the war there, and there was a war. And the president said, I can't do it without support of the general. You have to meet with the general. The general had referred to Nelson Mandela as a monkey. He said black people were subhuman, that whites were destined to rule. He went on, and he was explicitly racist. They met at Nelson Mandela's house. It was an incredible meeting. Nelson Mandela had servants, but he personally served the general tea. And at one point, the general was becoming uncomfortable with this hospitality. He said, let's get on with this. I didn't come here for niceties. For the next several hours, they had a negotiation in Afrikaner, in the general's language. As the general was leaving the meeting, his entourage said, did you tell that Nelson Mandela fell off? The general says, I don't know if I like him, but he can convince anyone of anything. We're going to have a ceasefire. This is bridging. Now the strength that it took is kind of amazing. But Nelson Mandela was recognizing what's important to the general. He was seeing the general as a person, even though the general was not seeing him as a person. And in doing so, ultimately, the general did see him as a person. So much so that when Nelson Mandela stepped down from the presidency, the general asked if he could make some remarks. And they said, there's people, the country still hadn't completely forgiven him. So they says, be quick about it. You have 15 minutes. And he gave his speech in Nelson Mandela's language, closer.
It's a beautiful story.
I don't think there's a better story about bridging, really. Thank you. That's remarkable. I knew some of that, but not all of it, and it's remarkable.
There was a study by Lee Ross and his students at Stanford some years ago that is also a very simple bridging story that I'd never thought of back then. It wasn't called bridging in those circles, but what they did was they took people who differed on abortion or on the Israeli-Palestinian issue or folks from Northern Ireland on different sides of the conflict. And they asked them to share their arguments, their positions on an issue, and found that those participants who were asked to repeat back to the other person the most compelling argument that they had made to them and why they thought, like what it meant to them. In those cases, both sides rated each other as closer together and more, and they felt they could collaborate. They could see a chance for peace. And really, I think one interpretation of this is just what you said, that both sides were feeling seen. So they didn't change their minds about anything. They weren't persuaded.
And the research is pretty powerful that when you see someone, and it's tricky, it's subtle, when you really see someone, first of all, you're not seeing them to change them, just to acknowledge them. But change is much more likely to happen. And so we're working on a number of projects, one called the Long Bridging Project. And we have to keep reminding people the goal is not to change people, but to see people. But in fact, people do change. There's a well-known conservative named Arthur Brooks. He used to be head of the American Enterprise Institute. He and I are friends. And he wrote in the book, Love Thy Enemy, and I'm in the book. And one of the things he says, I think he says in the book, is that out of our friendship, he said, I think a better person, but a worse conservative. And he said, the reason I'm a worse conservative is that when I think about a policy now, I think about not simply what John would say, but how it would affect John. I'm in a circle of concern. And so, this is Alpert's contact theory. When you really have contact with people, can see people, it's hard to hold on to that caricature, that they're evil, that they have, they don't have any love, they don't have any concerns. Again, like you said, it doesn't mean we agree with them, but we now see their complexity, we see their humanity. And in seeing that, something happens not only to them, but also to us.
That's incredible. John, thank you so much for the nuggets of gold in here. I think we'll have some hours of processing and unpacking. And
I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's very important reaching people and helping people on this journey. We all need each other.
Thank you so much for today, John.
Thanks so much to Bridging and Belonging. Nichole, wishing you and all of our listeners a happy holiday.
Likewise, may all of us find both bridges and belonging this year amidst our holiday gatherings.
We'll see you next time on Reimagining Us.